All right. Can everybody see? Thumbs up for those beautiful camera people. Awesome. All right. So tonight we're going to be talking about site assessment and tree selection. Hopefully the biology is still kind of fresh in your mind from last week. If it's not, no worries. That's why we record this, and that's why we have some extra information that you can always check out online. So we're kind of zooming back out that now we have the basic understanding of how a tree works, why it works the way it does, what it needs in its soil. Then what do we do with that information? What do we do knowing the different light requirements of different parts of a tree and how the hormones react to different exposures? Well, we use that information to help us choose where a tree grows, what type of tree should go there, and what a site looks like and what a site is telling us about what tree it needs. So without further ado, site assessment. So there are certain conditions that are ones that are kind of across the board you're going to look for, right? Obviously, we're looking for existing vegetation. Are there a lot of invasive species that this tree might be competing with that they're going to maybe be choked out by? What type of mitigation do you need? Do you need herbicide? Do you need mowing? Are they going to be shaded out? It might be kind of a no-brainer. You might think, well, of course I'll look around. I'm not going to plant a tree under a bunch of other trees, but you don't always know. So you got to look for that vegetation. What are the planting conflicts? Are there overhead or underground utilities? Are there buildings that are happening in the future? This one is really common, especially for our tree stewards, because a lot of you often get very involved in your communities, your small towns, your HOAs, neighborhoods. And in these areas, we have underground utilities, telephone lines, and 20-year plans for small towns. So knowing what's happening, you don't want to put these trees in the ground and then have a contractor take them out a year later because they're widening a road or putting in a sidewalk. We obviously want to look at our topography. If you're planting on flat ground, right? Or if you're planting on a 90-degree angle, probably not that one. But how much slope do you have? That's going to affect the runoff. It's going to affect the type of soil you have. Can that tree get a grip? And then deer and human pressure are two of our other big ones. Yes, there are other pressures from animals and insects, squirrel, rodents, definitely other bird pressure, but the two biggest ones by far that actually impact the success of a tree and its site assessment are deer and people. So every site is different. And that's something that's really important to remember when you're going into tree planting, that it's tempting to think, like I like a red oak. They're really good. They serve a lot of purposes. I'm just going to put red oaks wherever I can get my hands on. But that's not going to work across the board because just like every person, every tree planting is different. So you have to look at your soil type. If you're in an urban setting along a sidewalk, is it super compacted? Is it filled dirt that probably doesn't have a lot of nutrients? What is that competing vegetation? What's the soil moisture? Is it a site that's had previous construction and it's up on a hill? It's probably going to be very dry. Is it a site that's incredibly low in a swale that's going to be inundated during spring thaw? Or is there a vernal pool that only shows up in the spring? And is it dry in the summer? How much sunlight does it have? Just like with gardening, we're looking at hours of sunlight. And what are nearby infrastructures? And not only what are those nearby infrastructures, but will it interfere as it grows? Remembering that our trees might be put in the ground only a foot tall, but if everything goes to plan 100 years later, how big is that canopy going to get? So just as a reminder, when we're talking about our soil compaction, we're talking about our soil, not our dirt, right? So we have our sand, our silt, and our clay. So you can see we have spaces in our soil, and it goes down, and you get less and less space. And of course, we're aiming for that clay loam across the board. As close as we can get to that is the healthiest it's going to be. But you can plant in any soil. You just have to find the right tree. But particularly, I want to show you this close-up of the sand. You see we have a lot of air pockets. And if you remember from last week, we talked about why those micro pockets and macro pockets are significant because it's what holds water with our percolary action and oxygen and carbon dioxide air for the roots. When we have deep, deep soil compaction from thousands of people walking on an area for like a city or a campus park or a county fairgrounds, you're losing the soil compaction. And just like if you were put in an incredibly small box, you don't have space to stretch and grow, neither will those roots. So you can see this is a good example of compacted soil from cars and foot traffic here in this park. It'll be really difficult to dig. Sometimes you can take a shovel to it and it feels like you're hitting cement. You need to bring a pickaxe or a spud bar to get into it. You can see that grass usually won't grow very well in it. It's usually slightly eroded with gravel. Some trees won't be able to grow in this. And that's a really important selection that 99 to 100% of the time, if you put the wrong species here, it's going to fail. And that's because the soil is just not conducive for its growing environment. So you have to make sure to select a species that will do really well in this compacted soil. Something that's hardy, something that can really force its growth root with, it has a lot of auxin, right? That hormone has a lot of auxin and can force its roots into that area. We'll talk more about species that actually fit here later, but just a few: river birch, American holly, silver maple, three of the go-tos that are really hardy and can deal with this compacted soil. On the flip side, we have our wet soils. How many of you have seen this in your neighborhood or your yard, right? Or someone else's yard? When you get really heavy rain, you get this area that just kind of gets this little shine to it, a small pond. You might not think it's a big deal because it's not there very long, but to a tree, that's oversaturating its soil. We talked last week about soils and how much water they can hold. And when they're at their saturation point, that's when the tree can still absorb water. Once they go over that saturation point, the tree cannot absorb water anymore. And just like you or I not being able to breathe, the tree can drown if its roots can't also get oxygen. So we're looking for these low areas. And you have to look to see signs of these when it's not recently wet. If you're in a dry period, look for areas with caked mud. Look for things that dip down, that have other species that really like to grow in moist, wet areas. All right. Another one we want to look at, vegetation. So I talked about vegetation earlier, invasive species, things like that. This is a kind of a cross section of vegetation you might see, right? On the left here, you can see a nice open field. In terms of ease of planting, chef kiss, right? It's cleared. The vegetation it's going to compete with is already really low and mowed down. It might have, good aerated soil if it's not walked on a lot, and there's plenty of sun. So there's not really much competition here. That's going to be great. There is one spot about kind of looking for vegetation impacts in this photo on the left that might have an impact. Does anyone want to drop in the chat what they think that one sneaky element might be that's going to impact some tree success? Exactly, Tom caught it first, the shade. So you might see this big tree or this big field and think that's an ideal spot. And yes, it is. But how much is this spot in shade? That one particular spot. If it's in shade for more than 6 hours, what tree are we going to put there? It's going to be different than the one in the foreground and the background. We're going to put a tree that's a little bit more shade tolerant. And some of you might think during this planting, maybe not, because you guys ideally like trees, but some of you might think, this feels like minutia. This feels like, small details that aren't really going to have a big impact. But I want to assure you it really does, because once again, these trees ideally are growing from 50, 80, 100 years, and these are compounding factors that you want to set them up for success. And you don't want a tree in 50 years that is really weak and did not have a good growth habit and is going to drop its limbs and become dangerous to people, plants, and animals. So these things can have an impact. So in the middle here is probably what is one of our most common plantings with the Alliance. We come in and it's usually a farm field that has been abandoned. We have low shrubby brush that you can plant in, but you got to clear some of it first. You don't always have to clear it down with a mower, but you have to at least clear an area wide enough for the tree to not have direct competition. So you see we have a lot of briars in this middle photo. We have a lot of things like blackberries and raspberries. We have a lot of things that aren't going to get taller than the tree. So about 5 years in, depending on how big you plant the tree, this isn't going to be a problem, this understory. just the first 3 to 5 years that are going to be really significant when you have this type of growth, to keep it cut back from the tree so it can get enough light in competition with water and things. And then our favorite, least favorite over on the right. Sometimes you have vegetation that isn't there at different times of the year. So this has grown up all in one season and has completely shaded out this tree tube and has completely killed the plant inside. When these trees were put in the ground, because this is a perennial vine, or sorry, an annual vine, it's completely inundated it. So you want to look at your site, ideally, if you can, throughout the year. Look at it in the summer, the fall, and the spring as a minimum requirement. Winter, not so much. Usually going to see a factor. But see what different plants are there, because when these trees were put in the fall, all of this was died back and it looked like an empty field. So they didn't know that they were going to have this competition that they either needed to take care of mechanically or with an herbicide. So not only plants, people, we have to make sure our trees have enough space. There's some easy rule of thumbs that you guys can write down or you can remember. If you're planting by a building, make sure your tree is at least 15 feet away. It's a good rule of thumb because most trees for a long, long time of their lifespan are not going to get outside of that 15 feet. They might eventually, but it's going to be a long time. Sidewalks, make sure to plant at least 5 feet away. That doesn't have anything to do with the canopy, right? That has to do with the root base. As you can imagine, underneath the sidewalk is usually gravel and then compacted fill. Not a great growing environment. So we want to make sure that those roots have enough space to collect water and oxygen. And on top of that, we put it closer to the sidewalk. That sidewalk, with a short amount of time, as we've all tripped over them in cities, is going to buckle, right? Or it's going to crack. So it's doing the sidewalk a favor and the tree. Other trees, at least 15 feet apart. Same thing as buildings, giving that canopy space. And power lines, even more so, plant at least 30 feet away. Make sure that it has plenty of space, because if it gets close enough, those power line contractors are going to come in and cut it down. So other challenges, right, that you might have that, let me move this. There we go. Underground infrastructure. Once again, we look at this field around an apartment complex and you can think, perfect place to do a big planting. But if we look close, we see this storm drain here. We know that this area is going to get wet. There's all kinds of stuff going on underground in our urban areas, in our neighborhoods. Power lines, fiber optic, water, sewage, whitewater plumbing. It goes on and on. Sometimes gas, sometimes steam, depending on how urban you are. And so any of these can really, one, impact your tree, and we want successful trees, and two, impact the area. You don't want to cut off water flow, right? You don't want to cause a huge financial burden for yourself, for your neighborhood, for your town, whatever situation you are. You want to make sure that you're not damaging the site that you're in, because that's a great way to get people to never want to plant trees again. They say, I planted a tree here once and it cost me $50,000. It cost me $5,000 because it hit a gas line, because it hit a water line, because a volunteer hit my internet line. People don't want to do trees anymore. So we also want to be stewards, no pun intended, and make sure that we represent the tree planting community well and that we have success. Not just underground, but of course, above ground. I'm sure you guys have been driving down the road and seen these U-cuts. They're really common in urban settings. This is what happens when you don't have that 30-foot space around telephone wires. You want to look up the height and the spread of your tree. If you're planting a tree that's only going to get 15 to 20 feet tall and only about 10 feet wide, it's maybe not a problem. If you're planting a tree that on average, its canopy when it's mature is 35 feet wide and it grows to a height of 80 feet, that's really going to interfere with them. So you can see they're not trees, but these bushes here, that's not competing, right? That's fine to plant those bushes down along those power lines because their height and spread aren't going to impact the road or the power line. But this tree obviously was, and it's one, very unattractive, I would say. And two, it's just a horrible situation for that tree. That tree is not going to survive well. It's a huge wound. It's going to cause rot, and eventually you're going to drop these branches. And really, it's just that tree's life is pretty limited now. It's a short-term solution. So definitely we want to avoid this at all costs because you put 20 years of effort into growing that tree and then it's going to die in a few once it's cut back like that. So what can we do about that? Easiest way is a service called Utility. You can call them, you can email them, they have an online form. And the idea is before you dig any kind of area that might be, if you know for sure it's your own property and you know there's nothing there, that's fine. But if you're in an urban area, call Utility and they'll come out and they'll tell you if there are underground utilities. It's a free service and it's really easy to accomplish. I advise also if you're just curious about your property, you can call Utility. So definitely always get this checked out. In all of my professional plantings, I do a lot of plantings in the city of Baltimore, and I have Utility look at all of my sites before I do that. And I have the city of Baltimore tell me if there are underground spots. And I would say about 50% of the time, the city doesn't have something marked that Utility will find. So then I can say, glad I didn't plant there. Now, other than humans, and I know we got a lot of these up in PA for sure, are planting pressure from deer. So the two main areas deer are going to have an impact on planting pressure are both going to happen in the tree's first 10 years of life. It's going to be like the photo on the left, which you can see, which is predation. They're going to eat the shoots. And on the right, which is an antler rub. You can see that nice soft coating on the antlers. That's called velvet. It's the fastest growing matter, like mammal matter, bony matter of any mammal in the world. And as a result, it grows so fast, it gets insanely itchy for these deers. So they'll go crazy to do anything they can to scratch their antlers on something to rub off that velvet. If they find a tree, they will rub on it until the tree is, turns to dust essentially. And as we talked about last week, you break through that protective bark and you damage our phloem and our xylem, right? The tree's lost its vascular system. It's going to die. It's going to hemorrhage essentially. It can't support any of its growth up top, and it's not going to be able to survive. It's one of the most common, what we call basal scars at the bottom of a tree that you'll see. I don't have it photoed here, but deer are also really well known for predation by topping. So if you have a tree that's still low enough as a sapling, as it's growing, they'll come up and eat the very top off of it. That's what gives us a lot of those less productive growth habits where the tree then has to respond when it loses, as you remember from last week, hopefully our terminal bud. Remember that name bud? If you lose that terminal bud, it's then going to grow multiple buds to replace it. And that's once again opening us up for future damage from windstorms and ice storms. So that's why we put those tall tube shelters on our trees to keep the deer from eating them until they get tall enough. Another common conflict, hopefully no one on this call has had a conflict with them, but neighbors. Every state, every town, every jurisdiction has a different rule about how to plant trees with neighbors, who's responsible if it's close to a fence, if it's over the property, if a tree branch falls. So if you're planting on your own property, you're planting for an HOA, a retirement community, apartment community, what have you, always make sure to not just look at the planting property that you're on. You're planting with, Cozy Cottage HOA, and they have, 10 properties in their HOA that want trees, and you're like, great, I'm going to help you guys get these trees. I'm really excited. But beside Cozy Cottage HOA is one massive private landowner, right? Make sure to consult with them. You want to make sure that if their trees are too close, what's going to happen? Are they pro trees? Are they against the trees? Where is the fencing? If you have trees that are really close to that fence, obviously it's not going to do well long term. They should be planted on, nowhere that's so close to the property line that it's going to cause problems. So the other ones, planting conflicts with other trees. Just like you and I, if you're on the subway or a bus and it's really packed, If you're like me, you're like, I don't love this. I don't love being squished like a sardine can when I'm on public transportation. I like some space. Trees are exactly the same. They shouldn't be planted too close to each other or directly under one another. And you might say, well, hey, Edward, but acorns fall directly under a tree. Don't they grow up under that tree? They do, and then they don't survive because the parent tree outcompetes them. Animals carry all of those seeds away, or wind, right? Some other dispersal method, excuse me, carries those away. So once again, make sure you have that 15-foot planting. As they grow, those branches are gonna begin to interfere with each other. And there's this concept you may have heard called crown shyness, where a canopy avoids each other. There's some very lovely photos of it online. That's not actually something that trees do. It's a romanticized narrative. They will fully interrupt each other's crowns to compete for light. And when they do that is when you start to have branches from one or the other that die back. So not only are they competing in the crown, they're competing in the ground. They're competing with those water and those nutrients. Any given area only has so many nutrients that it can give to any given tree. If you overplant that area, just like if you have too many people eating at one restaurant, right? You're going to run out of food. Trees are going to run out of food. So we have a problem here in this photo to the right, obviously, because we have a large mature canopy tree already that's very close to this sapling. This sapling has almost no hope of growing successfully, and you can actually see the tree here on the right, which I apologize is slightly cropped out of the photo, is much taller and doing much better. And it was planted at the same time as the sapling. The sapling is so much farther behind because it just can't compete with the roots and the foliage of this larger tree. You got to make sure when you look around, what trees are you planting around? Give your trees enough space. So here's a quiz. We got a photo here of a classic planting for a lot of our tree stewards, a local park, or something in the county or the town that's unused. The county might not have the manpower to get the planting done, and you come in as a tree steward and you say, I would love to, plan this planting for you guys and get it in the ground. So you come to the site and you look at it. What are some of the obstacles, barriers, or factors you see in this photo that you should take into consideration when you're doing your planting? Go ahead and drop it in the chat. What do you see in this photo? Overhead wires. Okay, oh, I see that. What else? Multiple things. The smaller trees, shade from other trees. Okay. Compacted soil. Yes. Yep. And fence. All right. I think you guys got them all. Great job. So as you can see, we have our fence here, which is also under our power lines. So if we planted along this fence, we're going to have potential construction issues if they ever replace the fence. We might be really close to the property line if they ever expand this road, which would just, kill our trees in the future. And anyone who's doing landscaping, if they're mowing or weed whacking, really easy to damage the trees. And it's right under that power line. So we don't want to plant there because it's going to have two areas that are going to potentially have conflict with it. Power lines, like you said. The fence is also by itself an issue, right? So not just by the power lines, but because we're so close to this road, we also are going to have runoff from the road. And this was kind of a trick one because we haven't talked about it yet, but we will, in salt runoff. If you live somewhere with snow, and I happen to think Pennsylvania sometimes gets a little bit of snow at least, all of that salt, you might have heard, if you're a history nerd, Carthage and Rome salted the earth of Carthage back in the day to keep stuff from growing. That's not like a children's tale, that actually works. So road salt is a horribly destructive thing for areas. So when you're this close to the road, you're going to have pollution runoff that's also going to impact it. So this fence and this road are giving you some proximity. They're going to be problematic. And then you guys got this one, that compacted soil. You can see that this is an opening where cars have been coming in and out. They might be parking in different areas. So we know that we should look at the soils here and see, where's the soil soft? Where can I get a spade in? Where is it going to be really compacted? And I might need to amend the soil if I want to plant there. Or where should I not plant at all? And we have these gates that are also a really good signifier, right? Open and close. If you see a gate, someone's opening it eventually and driving through it. All right, how about this photo? What are some elements here that you think might be challenging to plant? Some are obvious, some are less obvious. Let's see, we got one new message. Signs, right? Can't block in front of signs. Underground infrastructure, very good. That's one of the sneaky ones. We see that we have a transformer box and we have a stoplight. That means there's probably underground infrastructure that's flowing up into here. There's only one little electrical wire or telephone wire. So there's probably a lot of underground infrastructure. Triangular easement for incoming traffic, right? Easy spot for things to run off the road, hit it. They might expand this eventually. The depression means water will accumulate, exactly. And what in that water will accumulate in particularly? Our salts, our heavy metals, our pollution. So if we're looking at this area for planting, it's not a great spot to plant trees. And that's why I put this photo in here, because as much as, trust me, as much as I would love to put trees everywhere, some spots shouldn't have trees. They should have other plantings. We want to do soil reduction. If we want to do carbon capture, low shrubs, wildflower garden, meadow, something like that would be more beneficial here. This spot has so many competing factors that it's going to be a really, really difficult spot to have success with your trees. So I also want you guys to set yourself up for success. Choose a site that actually, you're going to be able to have some success with, especially for your first sites. Now, maybe you're really passionate and you're like, this is what, I really want a tree here for a particular reason. It doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means that you really got to choose your tree and your site well. So, as a discussion question, many communities have overhead power lines that run over the front yards of property owners. If the community you're working with has a site constraint, what options do you have as far as planting locations? What are some other obstacles to planting? So go ahead and drop them in the chat. If you have a bunch of power lines, what do you do with that? You're still going to plant there, but what are you going to do? Low shrubbery, plant shrubs, definitely. Plant smaller trees, yeah. So we have so many low growing trees that are absolutely wonderful. Redbuds and dogwoods, two of the most beautiful native blooming trees in this area, don't grow that tall and are rarely going to impact your telephone wires. You can put redbuds and dogwoods usually under these telephone wires. So you plant those smaller trees, right? We're not going to be planting our sycamores or our tulip poplar being the tallest growing tree on the East Coast here. So you're going to plant those lower growing trees. You're going to work with the neighborhood to look at a list of trees that have maybe a height cap of 20 feet and say, what out of these trees do you like? Do you like this one? Do you like that one? Do you like this one? Serviceberry is another great one. Serviceberry is great for pollinators, beautiful white flowers, has berries, sometimes classified as a shrub, sometimes classified as a tree. So there's always a way around. All right, now tree selection. Speaking of redbuds, beautiful redbud here, which is one of my favorite trees to plant. Absolutely love them. In the pea family, the legume family, and fun fact, their flowers are completely edible. They taste a little bit like peas, and you can make a really nice purple glaze for a lemon poppy seed redbud glazed cake. So that's a little extra fact for you. So, anyways, right tree for the right spot at the right time for the right reason. Let's get into it. You have this urban tree guide by Casey Trees you can look up. It talks about your shape, your growth zone, your height, your spread, light, heat, salt, fruit, all of these factors that will help you decide what tree to choose for your urban location. And when I say urban, here it has a photo of a DC suburb. Anything that's not an active rural farm or forest is counted as urban in tree planting. So this is a free download from Casey Trees. I'll also have a link in the end of the slide, and we'll provide it in the recording. This is a great resource, and there are a lot of other resources to help you figure out what tree you want to put in the ground. You can also plug for our own organization, go to the Native Plant Center, watershed-wide, Chesapeake Bay Native Plant Center. It's run by the United States Forest or Fish and Wildlife Service and the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay. And you can go in and look up the plant type, how much sun it's going to get, what the soil texture is you have, how much soil moisture you have, and it'll give you a suggestion of species you can put there. This is a great tool. I still use this tool as a professional forester and arborist to figure out what tree I'm going to put where. And it also works for things outside of trees. It works for flowers, it works for bushes, it works for shrubs. So I said I was going to give you some examples. Here are some of the best. The few, the proud, the best street trees. There are others, but three of the best for native species: the American elm, the northern red oak, and the honey locust. All three of these deciduous trees can deal with compacted soil, salt and chemical runoff. They have lower consistent water needs. They're not like a sweet gum or red maple that want to have really wet feet, or even say a bald cypress that wants to be in the water, right? So they can deal with being in drought for a little bit. And they all have relatively thicker barks. You don't see me putting a sycamore or an American beech or blue beam on here, something that has a thinner bark, or any of our birches that have thinner barks or peeling barks. Because if it is hit by a lawnmower, if a kid with a baseball bat's just whacking it a few times in a public park, if a car even, kind of bounces off the side of it when it's, driving by or something, this thicker bark on these trees is going to help them survive. So these are three great examples of trees that can survive in your harsher environments. These are trees that you'll see in a lot of cities as street trees because they can handle those really tough environments. Now you might say, but I don't live in a downtown area. Maybe I'm not planting in the downtown area. What are really good trees if I'm still doing an urban planting, but it's in a neighborhood or it's in a yard? There are some yard trees that are also really good because they are diverse in their soil type. If you have sandy, if you have clay, if you have gravel, they're also going to live a long time and have a really good canopy, a strong canopy that if you're planting around homes, you want to consider trees that have a strong canopy so that they're not going to drop. Here we have our black walnut, we have our red maple, silky dogwood, excuse me, if you're looking for those blooms, chestnut oak if you want taller. Persimmon is a great food source, ecosystem services. Also, you can eat them. They're delicious if you get them right. If you get them before they're ripe, your mouth will shrink into a black hole because they're so tart. And our silver maple. These are images from the Biodiversity Heritage Library, which everyone can look up if you want to learn more about some of these images. Now, as with the urban trees, this is just a small list. Definitely take a look at the Casey trees or the native tree site to see the larger list, because I only have, deciduous here. There are many conifers in the area. Sweet Bay magnolia, American holly, all do well. You're planting, I will say, back on street trees, if you're planting in an urban area, it's very difficult to have a conifer do well. Pines, spruces, cypress, firs don't do well in, an urban area on a street tree. You can have some success maybe in a park if they've got a little bit more area, but if you're planting, in a planting box on a sidewalk or something like that, those trees are going to struggle. So for street trees or something that's particularly urban, you're usually best to stick with your deciduous, your hardwood. So identifying some planting restrictions. Oh, sorry. I had a separate slide there that was going to look over some things, but we actually already identified those planting restrictions. Let me see what time we got here. At 7:07, that's all we have for today. We actually did identify those planting restrictions already. What I was going to do here was have a slide to say, what are some planting restrictions in your area? Or if you have a spot that you're thinking about planting, and drop them in the chat, or I will actually stop sharing here and we can also chat as well. All right, let's see. There we go. So now we're back. I went a little quicker today. Sometimes I do that. Hopefully you guys all caught up or stayed caught up. But I'll open it up to questions. Feel free to raise your hand or come off mute or put a question in the chat if you have thoughts about constraints on your site or species recommendation, or you want to know what to do with hard soil, or you want to know why my favorite drink is eggnog. Anything. Go ahead.
I have a question. I live in an older town and we've lost a lot of our street trees to age, ash borer, and some other things. And for years now, I've just been hearing like, oh, you shouldn't plant there, you can't plant there, only this type of tree. But these trees, again, this is an older town, they've been around for 75, 80, 90 years. And okay, they're finally dying. So why can't we plant what we had there before? If it worked for the last 75 years, why won't it work again? I mean, I know climate change and some other things are impacting it, but the nature, the street hasn't changed, the sidewalk hasn't changed, maybe the soil's changed a little bit, but a lot of professional arborists and municipal authorities are really discouraging sometimes that tree on the right-of-way strip there between the sidewalk and the street.
Sure, that's a really good question. So you are right in that, hey, say this pin oak has done well, why won't the pin oak do well again? And you actually answered some of the question yourself, right? That one is if they were planted 100 years ago, the same soil that's under that sidewalk and under that road and under that parking lot or that building has been there for 100 years. It hasn't gotten a lot of mix over. Most of the nutrients in that spot are going to be depleted, which is probably why part of that, or mostly why that tree died. There's just not a lot of soil regeneration if it's covered with a lot of hardscape around it. So if it's covered with a lot of hardscape, the soil is going to have a really low nutrient load that fertilizer usually can't correct. It's also going to be much more compacted. Soil compacts over time, and 50 to 100 years is going to be, much, much more compacted than when those roots were able to get established 100 years ago. Once the roots were established and maybe got compacted around them, they were already there. It's harder for a new tree to grow and to fill those areas. We also didn't salt our roads and have a lot of the same chemical runoff even 20 years ago. So we have, some areas did, but to an extent, it's built up. So if we were salting for 100 years compared to 50 years, that salt has built up in the soil as well. Those heavy metals have built up in the soil. Even, our exhaust have built up. And as you said, climate change is an impact too. So can you plant a pin oak where a 100-year-old pin oak was? Yeah, you could give it a try. But I do agree with most of those foresters or arborists that it's not setting it up for success. And really what we're here to learn and try and figure out is not, can I put a tree there, but what is the best success I'm going to have putting a tree there? What tree is going to do the best so that it can benefit the environment, the community? Sometimes that doesn't apply, right? Sometimes you have a community that there's a historic tree that was lost or cut down, and they're going to replant a clone of that tree. And an arborist or a forester might say, it's not the best idea. It's probably not going to grow really well, or you're going to have to spend a lot of effort to get it to grow well. You're going to have to spend a lot of money on fertilizer all the time. You're going to have to water it a lot. You might have to dig up that sidewalk and that road and aerate the soil. So it can work, but it's harder. So we're trying to set you up for success. Let's see. I've got some questions in the chat. I thought silver maple was quite brittle when it gets older. It can get brittle. That's sure it's a fast grower. Usually it takes about 50 years for it to get a little brittle. But partially that is because in the past, arbor techniques, anytime a silver maple was trimmed, had low cut growth, and that caused a lot of wilt and mold. So we don't actually consider them a high risk drop tree, even though in their old age they get a little bit more brittle. Statistically, it's not a huge variable. Aren't American elms functionally extinct and red oaks beginning to suffer from wilt and scorch? There are many, many red elms, There are many, many elm cultivars and varieties that are resistant to a lot of our elm blights. And same with our red oaks. And this is actually something that we want to plant more of these cultivars. The more species we can get out that are resistant to these strains from nurseries and colleges, the better we can propagate more growth and keep these trees growing healthy. We want to diversify the gene pool. So as long as you make sure to get a cultivar that's resistant, then it should be fine. How far should you plant from underground utilities? That is an excellent question. At least as big as the canopy of the tree is going to get at maturity, at least. If you have an underground utility. So if that means 20 feet, that's a minimum of 20 feet. I might do 40. That takes it out of consideration a lot of time. And that's because those roots, as we looked in our slide last time, right? They go out beyond the drip line. They go out beyond the canopy. So if you really want to make sure that you're not going to disturb those underground utilities, you want to go farther than that canopy by a little bit. All right, I've got more written ones that I will read, but I also have a hand up by Tamila or Tamila. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. Would you like to go ahead and ask a question?
Yeah, thank you. So some of the answers to your question are confounding because that's some of the reasons why we plant the trees. So for example, to loosen soil, to uptake heavy metals, just some of that. And then with the last one that you were talking about, that would pretty much rule out planting any urban trees that I know of, because they are, going to be in an overhead or underground utility, bigger than their canopy, unless it's a super, super small tree. And even then, like, I'm just thinking about my town here in Carlisle, PA. I mean, they're literally in the sidewalk in a 3x3, and right under those sidewalks are, everything from utilities and gas, and because we have a lot of row homes. And I mean, I just, if we follow kind of like everything you talked about today, I really don't see installing trees in urban areas. I think they would just like make it impossible.
Well, and that's tough. And that's the reality that, if you want to have a tree that doesn't die relatively frequently or soon, as I said, not every site should have a tree there. Sometimes we have areas where street trees were historically planted, and there shouldn't be a tree there. It's a danger to the buildings and the property, it's a danger to people, or it's just not going to be successful. And that's when there are examples of other green infrastructure that we can put there. Could you put a small wildflower plot? Could you put shrubbery? Could you put brushes? Could you look into, rain gardens that could go there? Things that can also take up some of those heavy metals and absorb actually more efficiently. But yeah, sometimes trees, as I said, we want to get trees in the ground, but not all of our spots are designated or good for trees. If you have a 2 foot by 2 foot spot in the sidewalk that you think has gas and electricity running underneath it, and there's a historical building right beside it, I wouldn't put a tree there. I don't think it's a good spot for a tree. It won't set it up for success. And sometimes that's hard to hear because we want those beautiful tree-lined towns, but there are so many other options for us to try and reduce runoff and help the environment by planting and looking where else can we go? Can we go to the shrubs? Can we go to the flowers? Can we put in a rock garden? Can we put in a rain garden? But take a good hard look at, you'd be surprised sometimes, Miss Utility, there's not as much active underground utilities as you would think, especially in old colonial towns. Planting, as I've done in a lot of colonial areas myself, a lot of times they're defunct and they're no longer used, and you can plant near those. All right, I will jump over to some more of these. I'll try and get to all you guys while I still can. So thank you for having the patience with me. They're all great questions. Any recommendations for commercial corridors, Miracle Mile type roads, trees that can handle traffic, fumes, salt, etc. I would say any of your listed trees that you look up for urban trees, they're going to do just as well. The ones I listed, the elm, the honey locust, some of our oaks, they're going to do well. Once again, stay away from your spruce, your fir, your pine. They're not going to have a lot of success. But anywhere that you have, those lone quarters, same thing. Look for those same urban trees that are going to do well along a sidewalk because they're tough, are going to do well to handle traffic and fumes and salt. All right. From Dan, on sites that are private/private well and septic cisterns both represent challenges. How close can I plant these trees near these below ground structures, or should I plant anything at all? Both, I guess is the short answer. Should you plant a tree above a septic system or a cistern? The short answer from a plumber's perspective would definitely be to not do that because it inevitably will impact your system unless it is an incredibly deep percolating system. If you live in an incredibly sandy area, then your perk test is probably very low, and your drain field is going to be, maybe 20 feet or lower in the ground. If you're not in a sandy area and your percolation is really high, your tree is going to tap into that pretty quickly. Your tree might be pretty happy for a while, getting a lot of compost material, if it taps into that, but it's going to be a very costly repair on that private area. Wells are usually pretty well contained if they're modern. If they've been dug and installed after the 60s, they're not probably going to be tapped easily by a tree. They're planted with synthetic material, installed with synthetic materials that the water is not going to be able to leach out. If it's before the 60s when the well was put in, it's very likely done with dry stone, clay, or something that is more easily tapped into. So I wouldn't plant close to those areas. I would give them same thing if you can. Absolutely, like probably 20 feet, would be best to avoid it. Now, once again, plant something with roots that don't go as deep. The same thing for your trees that are smaller, like those red buds or those American hollies. Their roots don't go as deep. So look for smaller trees, or serviceberry doesn't go as deep, and many, many others. These are just some of the superstars I'm mentioning. But that's a great question. Phyllis says, I've frequently seen ginkgo trees in Center City, Philadelphia. Seems like these trees tolerate an urban environment. They do. I personally aesthetically love a ginkgo. Beautiful colors. They all drop at the same time. Why didn't I talk about them? They're not a native. They're not necessarily considered an invasive tree, but in this lecture with the Alliance, we particularly focus on native trees. So you do see a lot of ginkgos because, yes, they are quite resilient. But we don't focus on them here and inside the Alliance because they're not one of our native trees. And someone says they don't, provide a lot of benefits. Ascertain trees more resilient to strong, are certain trees more resilient to strong winds? That's a curious question that I don't get a lot. Thank you, Sanford. Yes, there are some trees that are more tolerant to strong winds. It's not often a common issue on the East Coast here. Usually that's something that's, or I should say, is on the coast. You need consistent strong winds to have an impact for a tree. Your oaks are going to probably be your strongest choice for your, easy choice for the strongest wood. If you have consistent high winds, like you're on the coast of San Francisco, you're going to plant some softwoods, actually, because if we remember that meristem bark that are under our bark, it heals and creates scar tissue. So things like our cypresses and pines can grow and respond to that constant wind that our hardwoods can't. But here on the East Coast, especially if you're not on the coast, and you're in PA somewhere, an oak is a real surefire choice where it just has some stronger wood and usually have very strong collars around their branches, so less likely to drop by wind. Eric asks, how can we manage deer and human pressure? I love this. May be addressed in a later session, but for example, when can you remove a tree tube without too much risk? how can we manage human pressure? I think is a question that you know, I don't know if society has an answer for it. It all depends on your location. If it's in a public park, people are going to be people. Sometimes they mess with trees. The best defense against a tree is good education, good signage, good staking. But at the end of the day, if somebody wants to tear that tree out, they usually can. But when it comes to deer pressure and human pressure, usually after those 5 years of getting an urban tree planted, your tree is going to be pretty successful. For deer, it's going to be tall enough that they're not going to be able to eat that terminal shoot. And the bark, while it still may be impacted by deer rub, will ideally have enough bark that it'll be able to respond. So 3 years is we're shifting in the industry from 3 to 5, which is actually great. 5 years, after 5 years, you can usually remove your deer fencing or your tube, and you should be, pretty strongly safe that that tree is going to make it. And if something else takes it out, that's another issue. With human pressure, the best thing we have found is staking our trees, and we'll go into how to plant trees later, but staking our trees and tying our trees to our stakes. That's the best sign to people like, hey, this is an intentional tree. Please don't mess with it. We have about 75% more success with different communities not disturbing the plantings just if we stake them. It's not necessarily because people can't get the stakes out of the ground, but it's just a clear signifier that there's intentionality, and it has people leave them alone a little bit more. But a good question. All right, I saw at least one yawn. I won't say who, but are there any other questions? If people are getting tired, we're getting close at 5 minutes here, that they want to type in or ask via the chat or voice. Oh, thank you, Natalie. No worries. I yawn all the time too. You knew I was starting with. I do it all the time when I'm giving a lecture and people get on me about it. Yeah, anything else? Yep. All right. Well, I appreciate it. Feel free to reach out with questions. It's hard just to readdress, those urban settings, but you can make something work. We can work with you. Your local extension office can work with you. We can get something in the ground. So don't feel hopeless. Something will grow. Something will always grow. It was a great evening again. Here at two. Goodness, I do need a break. It's 7:25. We're all good for the evening, and I will see you guys next time. Have a good one.
Thank you.